Can you explain how you come to the kind of base unit of per pupil funding, and how do you ensure that it is fair and accurate when it seems to be based almost wholly on what the historic levels were as opposed to what the actual costs are?
Yes, it's a good question, and what we did when we created the national funding formula, which is a very much fairer way of distributing funding, because previously we were basing the distribution of the funds to local authorities on historic data. So we're just rolling it forward a year. And yet different areas have changed their demographics and their proportions of free school meals and so on. So the first thing is we are basing all the national funding formula on current up-to-date data. How do we get to the proportions, the age-weighted per pupil funding? We aggregated 150 local funding formulae into one national. So it's like the wisdom of the crowds, essentially. And then we did tweak it slightly. So we put slightly more towards low prior attainment. But other than that, it's broadly speaking, roughly the aggregation of 150 local formula. And the beauty of the national funding formula is that once the principles are established, which they now are, and when we consulted on the principles, there was almost no objection to those principles. But if you think, Ben, that the 73% of the national funding formula that is the age-weighted pupil unit is too low, and you think it should be 75% or 80%, the beauty of the national funding formula is that we can have this debate nationally and decide that you're right, we'll move it up. Or you might decide that more should go to disadvantage, in which case we can tweak it and put a higher proportion. But it's transparent, it's open, and we can debate it as a country. And then you base the distribution of the school's block on the basis of that formula. I think it's a very fair system, and it's transparent, and we can have this debate about what precisely the proportion should be.
What oversight and control then do you have over local authorities? Because you give that funding to the authority and they give it to schools. They're not forced to give it in the same way as you tell them to. Exactly.
So that is another debate. So what we decided, initially we thought there'd be a 1 or 2 year transition period, so we would allocate the funding to the local authorities on the basis of the national funding formula, and then the local authority would allocate it to the schools on the basis of their local formula. And the intention, when we introduced the national funding formula, was to move to a hard formula eventually, so that it would be, we would fund the school directly on the basis of the national funding formula. Now, we wanted to make sure there was some flexibility for local authorities to respond to local issues. So if you're going from a local formula that gives, say, £175,000 fixed sum to each school to the national, which is 110, there are issues on that locally. So we wanted to make sure in these transition years, as we introduced, this came into force in 2018-19, we wanted to give local authorities that flexibility. So for 18-19, for 19-20, and we've also announced now for 2021, it will continue to be the local authority that distributes it to schools because of that flexibility.
Okay. We have lots of kind of pet projects and little extras and all the other things that little pots of money, whether it's mental health strategy, EdTech. You've talked yourself today, Nick, about 10 or 12 different pots of several £100 million that have gone to different things. Would it not be better and clearer, we've talked about long-term strategy, would it not be better to give schools the knowledge that they're going to have all of that money in their pot for the medium term, and then give them the control and the autonomy over how they spend it in order to be able to do precisely that, give them that local control of to be able to adapt to those needs. We have the system of free schools and academies on the basis of giving schools more control, more autonomy, but then we seem to be very controlling about what money they're allowed to have and for what purpose.
Well, there are two things. One is when we announce sort of mid-financial year that there's going to be more money. So, for example, the 250 million extra, 125 million of that was this financial year, which that's just finished, for high needs. The reason why we can do that is because we've got more clarity about whether we have any spare money within the overall envelope of the overall school and high needs funding. We can do that. So sometimes it's a matter of looking at the public finances and whether we can actually allocate a bit more. But then the other issue, and then that hopefully becomes part of the baseline, the other issue then is national programmes. So if we're training teachers across the system in how to teach computer science, that's a national programme. If we are trying to roll out the modern foreign language hubs, we have a scheme that's wanting to help schools teach modern foreign languages in the way the best practice shows. That's a national scheme, and then therefore then becomes a national fund. So, yeah, sure. So that's why
very
there's
concise answers.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. We talked a little bit about special educational needs already, and how that draws away from core funding to an extent. It seems particularly challenging in FE when you look at. I sat with Nadeem Zahawi a few weeks ago, looking through the predictions in terms of the cost in the future of SEND provision within FE. How disastrous is that going to be? How disastrous is that going to be when you look at some of the figures in terms of the growth in need compared to the funding?
Well, and again, we look ahead at the spending review, but separately to that, in FE, we are looking at the resilience of the sector. We're doing, I suppose there are three things that play into FE at the moment, which includes young people with special educational needs. One is the post-18 review, which is going on, which will touch into FE for sure. Secondly, we're looking at the resilience and the sustainability of FE. We've had the area reviews, we've had restructuring money, about 470 million has been distributed, I think, to date for that. We need to look ahead. We now have an insolvency programme in legislation in place, and we need to look ahead and say, how do we make FE sustainable? And you are right to mention young people with special educational needs, because actually in the FE debate they don't get a lot of mention, but you go into college. I was in a college recently. They've got 400 kids with special educational needs. That's a lot of young people. They interestingly do a fantastic job, and they never specifically mention it to me, but I think they see their work as getting these young people into employment. I think they see it very much through that lens, and they do a phenomenal job. But you are right, the figures coming through would suggest that this is going to become a bigger and bigger part of their work.
They're going to need the funding to do that.
Well, they need the funding and the right opportunities, actually, as well, because it is about preparing young people for future life, whether you've got SEND or not. So for a young person with SEND, actually getting into a job is a critical, I mean, it's life-changing for anybody, but particularly for those young people.
Yeah, and give you the opportunity to kind of defend the department, I suppose. You might have maybe seen in Schools Week, Lord Agnew's cost-cutting schemes, which I'm sure you'll be able to explain more clearly. But featured kind of throughout this are things like proposals to teach 3 classes in the dining room covered by temporary staff to save money. Things like getting rid of experienced teachers and having short-term supply instead. I'm assuming they're not things that DFE would suggest, but I wonder if you could kind of clarify what that's about.
Well, we're disappointed by the Schools Week article that basically chose to publish an article that takes a number of SRMA, School Resource Manager, advisors' recommendation out of context. And it is important that schools are using taxpayers' money as effectively as possible. And what the SRMAs are doing, these are very skilled school resource management advisors who can show schools how to use their money effectively to find efficiencies. So, for example, we have a national buying scheme for insurance that's significantly cheaper than insuring with your own insurance company. We have national buying schemes for energy, for buying equipment. There's the integrated curriculum and financial planning tool that looks at the array of the teachers and staff that you need to deliver a particular curriculum, looking at 3 to 5 year planning horizons based on the approach taken by the Outward Grange Multi-Academy Trust. So what we're trying to do, while we're also negotiating with the Treasury to ensure we have the best possible deal for education, what we also will have to demonstrate to the Treasury is that we are spending that money as effectively as possible. That's something that the NHS also has to deliver as part of its 10-year plan, and so do we. And what Lord Agnew is doing is making sure that schools are equipped to be as efficient as possible. And he's particularly honed in on the non-staff spending, the £10 billion that schools spend outside their staff budget to get that figure, to make sure we're spending that money as effectively as possible.
So what... Go on, sorry.
I was going to say, it's the same in FE. You know, during National Apprenticeship Week, I went to some colleges, you know, which are doing brilliantly, financially stable, investing in new facilities, and you go to another college that is struggling. And it's not due to lack of commitment on either organisation. So how do you spread the expertise that College A has got, doing very well, financially stable, into College B? It's different in colleges because they have a far more complex business model. But, you know, we glibly talk about, in every sector, spreading best practice. The truth of the matter is, it's quite difficult to spread it because people don't pick up the ideas. So it's the same in FE as well.
I've certainly seen examples in my constituency of, you know, local decision making within the college that have had challenges. So I get that. You talk about the spending review. Just finally, what would be your priorities? We touched on the kind of 10-year plan proposals and making sure that money goes to the right places, spent effectively within those plans. I think digging through the evidence that we've had here through our SCND inquiry, I think that the biggest single priority within that spending review should be dealing with that, frankly, and that funding for special educational needs in particular that seems to be the drain on core budgets and on teacher you know, time and all that kind of thing as well. I think that could be hugely impactful. But what is your kind of key recommendation to the Chancellor?
I absolutely do agree with that. You know, these are the most vulnerable children in our society, and we need to make sure that they are given the best education possible to equip them for life, which for some of them will be more challenging than for the rest of us. And we need to make sure that we give them the best start in life, and that means making sure that the funding is there. And that is a priority for our spending review bid. But I'm also concerned about post-16 funding, not just in FE, but also the sixth forms of schools, where we haven't been able to protect those budgets, and that is increasingly becoming a really serious challenge for sixth form, so that is also a priority. But, you know, it's a way of saying I've got three priorities, but I'm also concerned about overall school funding, and I do want to make sure that we are securing the best deal for all schools, because we know that they...